Describe the geography of ancient Egypt. What impact did their environment have on the way Egyptian society, culture, and religion developed? And really, you can't talk about Egyptian geography and its impact without talking about the Nile River. That is really the central element that made all of life in Egypt possible. And just in ancient Egypt, just like today in modern Egypt, about 95+% of the population lives along the banks of the Nile River. So the only thing that makes large agricultural states possible in Egypt is the Nile River. That being said, it's a incredibly good location for early large agricultural states because of the very stable flooding patterns that the river had. Of course, if you're doing a geographic comparison to Mesopotamia, of course, Mesopotamia last week that we talked about had the very chaotic flooding in those rivers, and even though it would bring this sort of rich silt down river, which would be good for agriculture, there was a big downside. In Egypt, you sort of get all of the bonuses without any of the drawbacks. The flooding happened every year about the same time period, and when it did, it brought in this new layer of fresh, sort of fertile soil to be used, and that really a lot of Egyptian life and theology and sort of the culture around it becomes very cyclical as well. It sort of bases itself off of the patterns of the river. So if you remember the Egyptian myth of sort of the Pharaoh being a god himself, the sort of incarnation of Osiris living on earth. When he dies, he becomes sort of the god of the dead, and his son takes his place as sort of the new incarnation of the god. And that sort of every dynastic cycle, this sort of just repeats. So there's always a god who is the Pharaoh. When he dies, becomes the new god of the underworld, and so forth. So a lot of focus on sort of the cyclical nature of their environment. Also, the importance of Ma'at, which we'll be talking about in a moment here, this idea of like order and balance and stability, also very important within ancient Egypt. And I'd say that definitely is linked back to their very stable geographic surroundings and that sort of very stable flooding patterns of the Nile River. Of course, the Nile isn't the only natural element that is important in Egypt. For example, the sun becomes very important to their religious ideology. The sun god in particular is oftentimes sort of venerated as the top of their pantheon as time goes on. Ra, the sun god, becomes sort of more and more powerful and important to their pantheon. So that also becomes a very, very important aspect. Also, a lot of their gods shared sort of animalistic features. So you can see that those animals that were present in the Nile River Valley, crocodiles and jackals, hippopotamuses, are also going to be very prevalent within Egyptian mythology as well. And if you look at sort of one of the other kind of key things that we think about the Egyptians, the pyramids, the only thing that made the pyramids possible are the really sort of strong limestone blocks that were able to be quarried on the sort of the banks of the Nile River, shipped down river, making sort of the shipment from the quarries to the building sites very easy, since they're going to be both right next to a very large river that is also very easily navigable, easy to navigate. Let's say that, and a very easy to navigate river, which is the Nile. So that the building materials for the pyramids also is sort of only made possible. The limestone, the granite, everything that went into building those pyramids came from the local environment. Eventually, writing on papyrus becomes, obviously, they start their own written record writing system, similar to what had developed within Mesopotamia, but certainly distinct. And certainly the way that they are going to be recording that is either on the walls of tombs or it's going to be on the sort of paper-like material called papyrus. So that also is going to be very important to preserving their knowledge and history moving forward. And also, the political stability of Egypt very much is tied in with their natural environment as well. There was this river that was very easy to navigate, like I said, which is going to make it easy to sort of connect everyone who is on that river together to make it one make it easier to have a sort of holistic culture where everyone's sort of under the same rulership for most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, under one pharaoh, under one administrative system, always sort of seeing themselves as kind of one people, as opposed to the Mesopotamians, who almost always saw themselves as different people, right? It was these different competing city-states, all sort of rivaling one another. And the geographic isolation that Egypt finds itself in. So while it's very interconnected internally, it's relatively hard for other peoples to come into Egypt. There's, like I said, deserts on almost every side of it. There's the Mediterranean Sea on the other side. So the only way to get into Egypt from outside of Egypt is either to come through the Sinai Peninsula, which is very dry and hot and arid and can be very, very difficult to pass, or by sea through the Mediterranean, which some people were very good at, but a lot of people that'd be a barrier to them, or you'd have to walk a very long distance across the desert in order to get into Egypt. So it really provided Egypt with a decent amount of isolation where they could sort of use the similarities of the geographic environments that they were living in, the ease to travel between one another to create a very strong centralized state, but not have that state constantly be put under pressure of foreign attack and invasion like you saw in the case of the Mesopotamian cities we talked about last week. And let's dwell a little bit deeper into this idea of Ma'at, which was described this week, which I think really sort of plays off that idea of the stability inherent in Egypt's natural environment. With the idea of Ma'at, you see it really being directly translated into Egyptian culture for a large degree. The idea that they want to try to make human societies and the human world as orderly as their natural environment, and that's really kind of at the heart of Ma'at. The idea that you're supposed to be trying to promote and preserve order and harmony and stability. The fact that it really backs up the cyclical nature of Egyptian religion, where it's a very orderly process of life and death, and of the sun becoming the new pharaoh, the new god, the old god becoming essentially the old king becoming the god of the underworld, and how this is supposed to essentially kind of be cyclical, and there's always should be someone in place supporting the idea of Ma'at, that this was kind of the ruling ideology that the pharaohs were supposed to be maintaining, and that was preserving this idea of order and stability to kind of try to match this the natural environment that they found around them. So it's interesting how you see this link between the natural environment, this link with religion, this link with kingship. Of course, if kings were perceived to have not been maintaining Ma'at, that of course then would be where problems could eventually arise and come in, and the fact that that was such kind of an important part of sort of the Egyptian ruling philosophy, I think it goes a long way to describing why the Egyptian culture was able to last for such a long period of time. Even within Mesopotamia, there's tons of different cities and kingdoms and empires that eventually rise and fall. But in Egypt, I mean, barring those sort of intermediate periods, you really have a much more stable line of a single kind of state system in place. And a large part of that is because of the natural stability of the environment, its relative isolation, and the idea that so much of their culture is based around the idea of preserving and emulating those sort of stabilizing factors within their culture and within their civilization. So for this question, we're looking at the engagement and impacts of Egypt and Nubia on one another. Of course, Egypt is on the part of the Nile that is sort of the upper portion of the river, closer to the headwaters into the Mediterranean, or not the headwaters, yeah, or it flows out into the Mediterranean. Nubia is upriver, where it is closer to the headwaters. So that is sort of where they're geographically located. So geographically, Nubia is south of Egypt, but both on the Nile. Both developed agriculture about the same period of time, and these two locations are going to really be influencing each other through most of their history. And one of the biggest items and aspects that's going to link these two regions is going to be trade and exchange. Because they're both going to have elements that the other one is going to want. Egypt, while having obviously very good agricultural lands, We know that the geography is not terribly diverse there. There's not a ton else besides the river valley, and then the surrounding desert. So one of the things that they were really lacking were sort of natural resources, and that's something that's going to be, of course, in abundance in more of continental Africa. And Nubia is going to be able to extend their trade networks even farther south into continental Africa and from their own regions, and they are going to be supplying Egypt with a lot of raw materials, things like ivory, ebony wood, animal skins, ostrich plumes, precious stones, and gold are all going to be collected other locations, traded to the Nubians, or the Nubians are going to collect those themselves, and they're going to be trading them to the Egyptians. And the main thing that the Nubians were looking to get in return were going to be more finished products. So things like pottery, textiles is going to be a big trade component for the Egyptians, wine. Decorative objects, decorative boxes, and so forth. Those are going to be the items that the Egyptians sort of take the raw materials, create these sort of finished products, and then we'll trade them back to Nubia, and the Nubia, of course, will trade them to other peoples in their trading network, and will be further enriching themselves. So trade ends up becoming a pretty important um, linking factor between the two, and it perhaps it's a very close trade relationship that meant that the military engagements between the two kingdoms were somewhat sporadic. Pretty early on, you do see Egyptian kings coming down and conquering Lower Nubia, but that sort of drives the upper, or sorry, the upper Nubian state to form the kingdom of Kush, which becomes sort of a very powerful counterbalance. And from that time period, Kush and Egypt are going to have very strong trading relationships, some military engagements now and again, but for the most part, they don't want to sort of jeopardize that mutually beneficial trade relationship between the two kingdoms. Other engagement, you definitely see a religious element between both of them. Some of the animal religious icons from Egypt are also popular in Nubia. And as time goes on, Egyptian gods become very popular in Nubia as well. The gods like Osiris and Amun-Ra are eventually going to have their own cult followings in Nubia. A lot of times, the Nubian upper class seems to adopt these Egyptian gods to a higher degree than the rest of the population, but they're going to get popular followings across the population. So certainly, religious exchange going on. The Nubians did not really practice mummification, but they did build pyramids. So it's another sort of cultural element that both the Nubians and the Egyptians are going to share, and shows that there is a lot of sort of cultural similarities between the two. And besides just trade and explorers going back and forth, there's a certain amount of immigration that takes place. It wouldn't be terribly unusual to find someone from Nubia in Egypt, or someone who had been born in Egypt in Nubia. Most of the time, this would have been a result of some sort of trade relationship being formed. But still, these two kingdoms knew each other very well, and throughout history are going to influence each other in a lot of these ways. So what are some of the similarities and differences that you see between the late Bronze Age civilizations and the earlier iterations of these civilizations? And do you find it all surprising that these civilizations, separated by hundreds or even thousands of years, were still so similar? Yeah, and I think that's one of the kind of interesting things is, from a historic perspective, to keep into account is that these civilizations, particularly in the case of Egypt, have a very continuous civilization for thousands of years, which is looking at our current perspective and thinking that our current country, the United States, has been around for not even 300. Um, it puts into perspective what an achievement lasting that long of a time is, and how so many of these later iterations share a lot of similarities with the countries and states that came before them. Um, so some of the similarities that people pointed out, they had similar religions in these various locations. So the Egyptian religion, of course, is going to change over time. The focus, to a certain degree, at the top of the pantheon goes from Osiris and Horus to Amun-Ra throughout time. But there's other gods and goddesses, like Isis is going to have a very important role with Egyptian religion all the way through this time period, and even after the Egyptian time period is going to be very important in the region. Same thing if in the case of the Mesopotamian religions. The Babylonians for a long period of time had Marduk as sort of their leader of their pantheon of the gods, whereas other Mesopotamian towns had other gods, Enlil or Ea or other gods, at the top. But throughout time, the Babylonian Empire is always going to have sort of Marduk in that capacity. And even though there's a lot of similarities between the stories and the epics and so forth within Mesopotamia, you're going to see a lot of continuity. Same thing with the Assyrians and the Hittites as well. They're also going to have very similar geographic ranges. You see, Egypt, for example, is going to be pretty much filling the same area in the late Bronze Age as it was throughout history, except for you can add in some like territorial expansion for Egypt into more of the Levant area through the Sinai Desert into the sort of that Canaanite area. But Babylonians are always going to be sort of forming empires around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, traditional Mesopotamian area. The Assyrians are always going to be somewhat north of there. They're sort of closer in geography to the old Akkadian capitals. And the Hittites are going to be a little bit farther east from there in sort of the Anatolia, or sorry, farther west, I should say, into Anatolia and sort of modern day Turkey. And that throughout time, though they're going to be sticking there, even though sort of the bounds of their empires are going to be fluctuating. They're also going to have very similar writing styles. Cuneiform is going to continue to be the primary writing system for the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and same thing. Hieroglyphics are going to be the same writing tool that the Egyptians are going to be using, and even though the intricacies of the language are going to change somewhat over time, it's going to still be very consistent. There's also cultural similarities that you see. The leadership models, the kingship models of the various states are going to be very, very similar throughout time. Egypt, of course, gets sort of close to trying to shake things up a little bit in the Amarna period, and they also have more diversity in their leaders as far as women being able to become pharaohs and take on power. But that's something that's fairly consistent within Egypt, whereas these other city-states and empires are not going to be, that's going to be far less common if it happens at all. And of course, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh is going to continuously be important to the Mesopotamians, and there's going to be various versions of it recorded over and over again. So that's one of the reasons we know so much about it, is because we have various iterations of this story throughout time. But there's also a lot of cultural differences that you see throughout time. For example, the Egyptians stopped building pyramids. All the great pyramids were built fairly early on in Egyptian history, and particularly the purpose of the pyramids was to be the tomb and the resting place for the pharaoh and sort of help and assist their ascension into the afterlife. But it's very important in that sense that they're sort of living gods, that their tombs don't get violated and robbed. And unfortunately, throughout time, that happens to every single one of the pyramids. I mean, essentially, a pyramid is just a giant billboard to looters saying, dig here. So by the time you get to the New Kingdom, while burying the dead with burial goods and items is very, very important, it becomes much more secretive. They're hidden away in the Valley of the Kings and sort of secret tombs that they try to cover up and make sure no one knows where it is, so that their tombs won't be looted or desecrated. So some cultural differences like that you can see cropping up as well. There's new technology that comes along. Of course, bronze being a big one in reference to the late Bronze Age, where the weapons and tools and so forth are going to be much more common. Chariots become the sort of most important military item. Horses were introduced at one point in time, but rather than have sort of strict cavalry units, the primary way of utilizing horses was to pull these large carriages kind of behind them, where people would sit with bows and shoot at their enemies, or with weapons and sort of stab at them. The Syrians actually put kind of like swords on the ends of them, so they kind of drive through enemy ranks to try to sort of scythe them down. So chariots were kind of the most important military advancement that occurred during this time period. They also had very formalized state systems that you didn't necessarily see existing prior to this, meaning that everyone sort of knew where everyone else was. There weren't as many sort of blank areas on the map, so it was relatively less likely that a completely unknown force was going to come in and invade your lands. Like it was a little bit more easy to have happen, in the earlier iterations of these civilizations. And also tying all these formalized states together was a much more intricate um, version of diplomacy that was linking them together. There was a lot more trade and diplomatic communication between these various states that you didn't necessarily have in the earlier versions, which are a little bit more isolated and sort of doing their own thing. So those are just some of the similarities and differences that some of you pointed out and that I wanted to mention here as well. And other people had sort of varying levels of surprise. Some people pointed that, well, because the geography was so similar and the way that they were living was so similar, the agricultural practices, were very similar in both locations, that it's not all that surprising that life didn't really change a whole lot in that amount of time. And I certainly understand and think that is a very good point. At the same point in time, people still said it was just the sheer fact that they were able to maintain themselves and their culture for such a long period of time is certainly something that is surprising or certainly noteworthy, if nothing else. So this was a fun question. Pretending you're a filmmaker and you're trying to make a film or pitch a movie idea for a film set during the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilizations. And it was really cool to see the different directions that everyone took this. I saw a few people wanting to display the conflict between the Hittites and the Egyptians, or the two biggest power players at the time diplomatically, and how the sort of warfare sort of wore both sides out and sort of left it more susceptible to these other issues that were going to come along, but also all the sort of like diplomatic maneuverings and sort of large war epic that you could make with that kind of a conflict. A lot of people had their movies set around the Sea Peoples, sort of the influx of these peoples coming from various locations around the Mediterranean world for various issues, whether it's natural disaster or other warfare or whatnot. Having to relocate themselves, whether they're coming as conquerors or refugees, and sort of all the issues that could take place there. Some people focus on the natural disasters element of this, earthquakes or volcanoes, things of that nature. We could make some really good disaster movies from this point in time and see sort of how these, onset of disasters could potentially impact all these various kingdoms. Someone wanted to focus on the Canaanite city-states and their sort of transition into the Phoenicians, and sort of how it was more of a hopeful story of how things get rebuilt after this time period. And someone also wanted to sort of focus more on the trade issues and the collapse of commerce and the impact that's going to have, and made a joke about how they wanted to get George Lucas to direct it because they thought he really liked his trade issues, which I believe was someone taking a shot at the prequel Star Wars trilogy, but who knows? Maybe George Lucas would like to direct a trade breakdown of trade films set in the late Bronze Age. I'd probably watch it. Sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. A lot of different genres that people have put their films in, whether it was an action or war movies or epics or natural disaster movies, romances. Someone pitched a buddy cop kind of idea. Not cops, obviously, but two people, sea peoples roving around, being sort of funny and having misadventures. So a lot of various really creative ways that people took this question. So it was very fun reading them. So thank you for all the amusement I got on my end, and hopefully you had a good time contemplating and thinking about this question. So when we go through, take a look at the two documents and discuss some of the differences that you noticed between the Egyptians and how the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians perceived their natural environment, particularly the rivers. A lot of people use this very first quote out of the document on the Nile to kind of show the perspective the Egyptians had of the river. Hail thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt. I think very simple, straight to the point. A lot of people point out that they thought that the Egyptians were worshiping the Nile almost like they would worship a god itself, which is, I would say, very, very true. Moving down to our next example here, you kind of see you create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring perpetuity of the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish.
So once more showing all the kind of the benefits, what the river allows, and stating right off the bat that if you take that away, the human societies are not going to be doing great. And certainly the Egyptians recognized where all their prosperity was coming from. Another line here that some people used: he shines when he issues forth from the darkness to cause his flocks to prosper. It is his force that gives existence to all things. Once more, a great way to put it, showing the importance of the river. So pretty much all the depictions that you see of the river here in the Egyptian document are all very positive, right? It's life-giving, very beneficial to humans, making all things possible. You can compare that then to really the kind of depictions that we have of water and flooding and the river system within the Mesopotamian document, within the Epic of Gilgamesh. The first line that some people point out was: in the morning, cakes darkness, kind of darkness caking the sky. In the evening, a rain of wheat, real heaviness shower down. So pretty much the land becomes really dark. It begins raining incredibly heavy. And I saw the shape of the storm. The storm was terrifying to see. So sort of showing how, remember how a lot of these floods got started was storm systems sweeping over the plains into the mountains. There in the mountains, Lorraine would kind of create this flood system, which would then swash down. So kind of showing how seeing this process occur is pretty interesting here. And that's backed up in our next passage here. Like the battle force of the destructive Kashahu weapon passed over the people, kind of the flood weapon. No man could see his fellow, nor could he be distinguished from the sky. Even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. How the flood kind of washed down, took everyone by surprise, and really kind of comparing the river here to a weapon that the gods are in fact using to punish humans. I don't believe it was the entire story was included in this version that I have in the document. But essentially, the initial reason why the gods decide to punish humanity is because humans were making too much noise and the gods were having trouble to sleep, having trouble getting to sleep. So the head god decided to pretty much wipe out all humanity so they'd just be quiet with all their warfare and chattering and carrying on. Um, so that there really, wasn't a real kind of strict moral reason why they were punishing the humans. It was more just because they were being inconvenient to the gods. And once more sort of shows this really clear idea of how the gods have this very kind of fickle relationship with humans and just kind of turn them on a whim. Very similar to how you see the storm come up very rapidly, right? And this anger is suddenly unleashed on the people without warning. The wind blew, the flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. When the seventh day arrived of the tempest, the flood and onslaught, which had struggled like women in labor, blew themselves out. So kind of showing this entire process of how the wind blew, the flood came up and rose up, and how all this then eventually blew itself over. So certainly showing a much more hectic and a much more kind of aggressive version of the river, and being used as a weapon against the people, not being the same sort of sustainer of life that you see in the Egyptian document. So how, for question number 2 then, does this impact Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture, and specifically how they perceive their gods? So very similar to how they perceive the rivers, the Egyptians here are portraying their gods in a very important and kind of beneficial way. Watering the orchards created by Re, or Ra, the sun god, to create all the cattle to live, you give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one. So saying that Re had this creating the orchards, creating positive and beneficial things. The next slide down here: if the gods suffer in heaven, then the faces of men waste away. So this link between how the gods are important and how when the gods suffer, humanity suffers as well. Moving down, the children Sobek and the sons of Ninus, the cycle of the gods which dwells in him and are prosperous. Once more kind of showing this idea of how much the cyclical nature of the gods is important to the Egyptians and how that's tied into the cyclical nature of the rivers themselves. And finally down here, men exalt him like the cycle of the gods. Once more this idea of the cycle. They dread him who creates the heat, pretty much the sun god Ra, even though he, Ra, has made his son Osiris the universal master in order to give prosperity to Egypt. Come and prosper, O Nile, come and prosper. So once more showing a much more kind of positive view of the gods themselves. And even though Re, the sun god, could have a kind of harsh connotation to him, and that people could dread kind of the heat that was coming down, certainly the Nile River made all of that beneficial still, and kind of made it so that everyone could still prosper. Comparing that then to depictions of the gods. Um, right here, you kind of see the gods playing a direct role in this quote as far as bringing the storm and bringing the clouds and bringing the flood that ultimately ends up having these kind of devastating consequences, which you have been talking about. A black cloud came up from the base of the sky. Adad kept rumbling inside it, kind of the thunder, right? This thunder god. Shalet and Hanish were marching ahead. March as the chamberlains over mountain and country, so once more beginning in the mountains and rushing down into the countryside. Icaral pulled out the mooring poles, and Inerta marched on and made the weirs overflow. Pretty much the dams, things that were supposed to keep the water in check, were made to overflow and flood the nature. So pretty much saying right here, God by God, who is doing what in this process and how they are making this flood come down to the people. Um, nope, I think I misplaced that one. There we go. And of course, after this flood is up, Enlil comes down and kind of sees what happened and is ultimately furious that the flood did not actually kill all of humanity, kind of saying, what sort of life survived? No man should have lived through the destruction, saying he wanted to really kind of wipe out all humans and was pretty dismayed here that one of them had managed to survive. Through the process of sacrifices, though, pretty much the gods are able to become appeased. Enlil is the one who is kind of the angry one, while Ea is the one who is trying to warn humanity and benefit them, and pretty much talks Enlil into trying to find other ways to punish humans for the transgressions, particularly because remember it mentioned earlier how the gods themselves were actually afraid of the flood, which I think was a kind of a very interesting thing to put in here. This idea that even though the flood was a weapon imposed by the gods, it kind of got out of hand and out of control, and they had to run back up to heaven before it would destroy them as well. But instead of punishing people with the flood, which was so devastating, saying here, instead of imposing the flood, let a lion come to diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let a wolf come to diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let famine be imposed to lessen the land. Instead of your imposing the flood, let air rise up and savage the people, kind of these other angry people around the Mesopotamians. So really just kind of trying to say that the flood was kind of viewed as such a devastating weapon, and trying to convince the gods themselves to find sort of these other ways to punish humanity. And it's kind of, sort of, it really gives a good viewpoint of the mentality of the Mesopotamians. Sort of right here, they're trying to pick their poison, right? Kind of saying we'd rather be eaten by lions and wolves, we'd rather succumb to famine, we'd rather have warfare with other people than actually have this flood let loose on us again. Sort of showing the mentality that they came through. But very different depiction of the gods within our second document here than what you saw in the exaltation of the Nile. So those are some of the main key points that you could have pointed out to make your arguments for the first few questions. The third question was very interesting. A lot of people took this in a lot of different directions. In kind of what ways the environment continues to affect civilizations today. Some people made very good connotations as far as, look at the weather and the climate, what can be grown, how does that affect, the way that we make our lives here today, as opposed to people who live in Florida, as people who live in California and warmer climates, or people who live in Arizona and more of a drier climate, how that still has quite a bit of effect on local economies and how people are living their lives. Some people brought up the idea and the issue of global warming, and saying that this environment still has a very big impact on our lives. Potentially, this could be coming much more to the forefront of people's kind of awareness of the environment and the impact that it has on civilizations, particularly if some of these very negative consequences that people are speculating about actually ultimately end up coming to fruition. And some people kind of look specifically at the Nile River from them until now, just kind of showing the how some of the issues are still kind of around the river today, pollution and things like that, and how people are still, though, kind of dependent and reliant upon a lot of these same environmental resources that we were very early on in the process of kind of the development of these large stratified states. We're still reliant upon them in very much kind of the same ways today. So that's the end of our week 3 review. Good job, everyone, and I'm looking forward to reading everything going into that was week 3, so, or week 4. All right, thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week.